In this episode, we continue exploring the shaking soil where early care and education first take root. Building on our last conversation about wartime policies and exclusion, we now dig into redlining, inequitable funding, even in programs like Sesame Street, and the powerful community-led advocacy of the Black Panthers. We'll examine how government systems made it harder for communities of color to build generational wealth through education. And we'll celebrate how grassroots organizing carved out new pathways, how programs like Sesame Street and public access TV tried to bridge the gaps, giving children with limited access the tools to thrive. Because when the branches are tangled, sometimes you have to create your own life just to grow. As a child, it was a core memory for me, sitting with my family watching Sesame Street and all the offerings of PBS. I loved the songs. It fueled my love of reading. And it wasn't just Sesame Street. It was LeVar Burton on Reading Rainbow who helped me see myself in science fiction I already loved. I had grown up watching Star Trek, seeing Uhura on screen, but it was LeVar Burton who connected that to learning, to literacy, to possibility. Sesame Street introduced me to opera, to different cultures, different neighborhoods, and showed what it meant to be kind to everyone, no matter how different they were. The impact of Sesame Street was powerful, and honestly, it still is today. But it raises a question. Why was there such a need for a show like Sesame Street in the first place? Why did so many children in urban areas, often labeled the ghetto by outsiders, rely on PBS and Sesame Street for their first educational experiences and social-emotional learning? Let's begin with redlining, a practice that didn't just shape where families could live, but who allowed access to opportunity itself. As we move through this section, it's going to be hard to hear, much like the history we've explored before. But don't pull up roots just yet. Burrow deeper into these uncomfortable truths, not just for yourselves, but for the children and families around you. Redlining was a discriminatory system created by banks and reinforced by government policies to deny loans based on race, culture, and location. On the surface, it looked like a financial tool. In reality, it was a map of exclusion. And redlining wasn't just about homes. It became a blueprint for withholding opportunity, impacting everything from small businesses to public schools to whether a neighborhood would ever see a high-quality child care center. Public schools were and still are funded largely through property taxes. When communities were boxed in by red lines, those areas were automatically stripped of wealth-building opportunities. And without that tax base, schools in these neighborhoods had fewer teachers, fewer resources, and fewer safe spaces for children. That meant families had fewer early learning options, less access to quality childcare, and a greater reliance on community-led care or even public television to prepare their children for school. Meanwhile, suburban districts just a few miles away thrived with well-funded schools, state-of-the-art playgrounds, and access to programs that redline neighborhoods could only dream of. These maps didn't just reflect bias, they created it. They told the world that entire communities weren't worth investing in, and once those lines were drawn, they were almost impossible to erase. So where did redlining come from? According to a 2017 NPR article, it began in the 1930s with the creation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLCA. This was part of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, meant to stabilize the housing market during the Great Depression. Millions of families were at risk of losing their homes, and HOLCA stepped in to refinance mortgages and give relief. On paper, it was about saving the American dream. But here's the truth. While HOLCA may have propped up the housing market, it also embedded segregation into law. In order to decide who qualified for loans, HOLCA sent out appraisers to cities across the country. They created what were called residential security maps, color-coded to rank neighborhoods from A to D. A neighborhoods, shaded green, were considered the safest environment. B areas in blue were stable but less desirable. C neighborhoods in yellow were described as declining, and D neighborhoods, outlined in red, were deemed hazardous. What made a neighborhood hazardous? It wasn't the quality of the homes. It was the people who lived there. If a neighborhood had Black families, immigrant families, or even the potential for infiltration of non-white residents, it was automatically downgraded. According to the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, those maps were drawn for almost every major city in the United States. They weren't hidden. They were widely distributed to banks, insurers, and governments, and became the playbook for who would and would not receive loans or investment. By the 1940s, nearly every U.S. city had a red line map in place. And here's something many don't realize. Credit scores, the numbers that decide today if you can buy a house, start a business, or even open a child care center, have only existed for about 40 years. But HOLCA laid the groundwork. They created the first standardized way of labeling people as worthy or unworthy of investment. And worthiness was never neutral. It was tied to race, gender, and location. This framework didn't just block families in the 1930s, it planted the roots of our modern financial system, one that still restricts access to families of color, for women, and for anyone who doesn't fit the mold of the ideal borrower. And it wasn't only civilians who felt the sting. Military service members of color, men and women who risked their lives in uniform, came home to find themselves locked out of the very benefits they had earned. While white veterans used housing programs and loans to move into booming suburban neighborhoods, Black veterans often couldn't. The country they served promised them opportunity, but the maps made sure many of those promises were out of reach. When the city wouldn't invest and the banks wouldn't lend, how could these communities maintain their infrastructure, let alone build schools or child care centers? It would take decades until the Fair Housing Act of 1968 for redlining to even be outlawed. By then, the damage was deeply rooted, and its effects on housing, education, and childcare access are still with us today. According to NPR, efforts to help Americans gain a piece of the American dream were framed as programs for everyone. But in reality, they were built for white Americans, specifically middle class and lower middle class families. Black families and other families of color were often left out of the very expansions that shaped the future U.S. housing. And what is often not spoken about is this: the builders of those new suburban subdivisions, which were going up at record pace in the 1940s and 50s, openly requested that their homes not be sold to Black or brown borrowers. So while white families were moving into brand new neighborhoods with fresh schools, playgrounds, and well-funded services, Black families were locked out, not just from homes, but from the wealth and educational opportunities those neighborhoods created for generations to come. Redlining wasn't outlawed overnight. In fact, it took decades before these practices were even formally challenged. And during that time, Black families and other families of color were pushed into neighborhoods that were labeled less desirable. Those neighborhoods received less investment and less funding to maintain housing, schools, or community services. Over time, the lack of investment created what we now call food deserts, underfunded schools, and neighborhoods without adequate access to safe, affordable childcare. And layered on top of that neglect came heavy policing. Communities that had already been boxed in were now over-policed in ways that deepened mistrust and destabilized the very neighborhoods redlining had starved. It was often described as equal, but it was never equal. It was separate. And it was designed to keep families of color in an ongoing cycle of economic depression and limited access to opportunity, including the opportunity of early education. How does redlining impact childcare, you ask? It shaped it in ways we are still untangling today. Business owners or even neighbors who wanted to open family childcare homes during the rise of licensing faced bias in a system that was never built to help them improve their communities. Just like food deserts emerged because Black and brown families couldn't access loans or funding to open grocery stores in their neighborhoods, childcare deserts emerged for the same reason. The banks wouldn't lend, the city wouldn't invest, and without that support, many childcare programs never had a chance to open. Even when families paid taxes, those funds weren't invested back into their communities the same way suburban neighborhoods saw new schools, parks, and childcare centers spring up. For family childcare educators living in buildings neglected by landlords or the city, it was an uphill battle. They wanted to serve neighborhood children, but licensing was often out of reach, blocked by unsafe buildings, lack of access to clean water, or other health and safety concerns beyond their control. Yes, there were always those who still stepped up and cared for children in their neighborhoods, but they did so without the same access to licensing opportunities, professional recognition, or financial support that educators in more economically privileged areas had. In the 1970s and 80s, the myth of the welfare queen, a racist and gendered trope, was used to paint Black mothers as lazy, deceitful, and unworthy of public assistance. This stereotype helped justify stripping away support from low-income communities and tightening public aid policies, further starving redline neighborhoods of vital resources. The story politicians leaned on centered around one woman, Linda Taylor. She was accused of defrauding the government and conning multiple men out of money. And yes, according to NPR and other sources, she did commit fraud. But here's the twist. Although the face of the welfare queen has long been portrayed as a Black woman, census records show Linda Taylor was actually listed as white. But the truth didn't matter. The image stuck because it played into existing fears and biases about Black mothers. Ronald Reagan, then running for president, used Taylor's story on the campaign trail in the late 1970s, calling her the welfare queen, who lived lavishly while others worked hard. His message was clear. Welfare wasn't helping, it was being abused. This rhetoric had consequences. It fueled public resentment toward anti-poverty programs and created momentum for policy cuts in the 1980s. Aid to families with dependent children, or AFDC, food assistance, and child care subsidies were all placed under stricter rules or reduced. And here's what's often forgotten. Many of those who relied on social programs needed access to child care so they could work. But because of the stigma being promoted, unfair regulations were added. Work requirements tied to hours, mandatory drug testing, and eligibility hurdles that disproportionately impacted women, all while these same women still couldn't find quality childcare near their jobs. The system punished them for trying to balance work and care. And the narrative didn't stop there. In the 1990s, the Democratic Party leaned into the same framing. President Bill Clinton promised to end welfare as we know it, and Hillary Clinton spoke about cracking down on dependency. Their language painted a picture of programs being overused or exploited, despite the fact that statistics never matched the story being told. And even when these women did work, the system was stacked against them. According to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, the income for working mothers fell by nearly 18% between 1995 and 2005. Reform wasn't lifting families out of poverty, it was pushing them deeper into it. But that nuance was lost in the political spin. Instead, the myth was reinforced. If you were poor and needed support, especially for your children, you were suspect. You were taking advantage. You weren't worthy. For families already boxed in by redlining and living in childcare deserts, this meant even fewer safety nets. The programs that might have supported them were being dismantled in the name of reform. And once again, the families who needed childcare the most were pushed further away from it. All of this, the access or lack thereof, helped set the stage for the creation and uplifting of Sesame Street. When children stayed home with no access to the quality education or experiences their peers in suburban neighborhoods had, they started school already behind, though through no fault of their own. The creators of Sesame Street and later champions like Mr. Rogers and PBS saw this gap and wanted to address it. Their goal was clear: to create a pathway to knowledge, to open doors for children who have been shut out, and to make learning possible no matter where you lived or what resources your family had. In the documentary Street Gang, How We Got to Sesame Street, we learned that Sesame Street first aired in November 1969, a time when most children's television was little more than a string of advertisements. The creators of Sesame Street had a bold goal to help children understand the world around them. And during an era marked by civil unrest, the goal wasn't just radical, it was revolutionary. At its core, Sesame Street was designed to address the socio-economic learning gap, to make sure that children, regardless of zip code, had access to the kind of early education they deserved. The creators of Sesame Street, while creative and fun, did not build the show on opinions alone. They built it on research. A study commissioned by the Carnegie Corporation explored whether television, a still relatively new technology, could be used to support educational gains. And what that study revealed was groundbreaking. Television could help the playing field. It could level it. With that research in hand, funding was secured to form the Children's Television Workshop. And that workshop would go on to launch Sesame Street, one of the most ambitious, research-based early childhood education projects the country had ever seen. For many children in urban neighborhoods, PBS became their first classroom. It wasn't just entertainment. It was survival learning. But here's something important to note. Not all PBS shows reach the same children. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood wasn't created specifically for suburban audiences, but that's where it was most often aired. And that's where it found its strongest reach. Sesame Street was different. It was made for the children who were being left behind. The Children's Television Workshop, led by Joan Gantz Cooney, deliberately designed Sesame Street for children in urban areas, kids who didn't have the same privileges or access to preschool as their suburban counterparts. That's part of why it made such a splash when it first aired in 1969. It wasn't just another children's show. It was a lifeline. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was already on the air when PBS appeared on the scene in 1969. PBS, the public broadcasting service, was created as a way to expand access to news, culture, and education. And it was federally funded, supported by viewers like you. The entire point of PBS was to make sure education and culture weren't limited to those who could afford it. It was designed to reach communities that didn't always have access, both in rural areas and in urban neighborhoods. That's why the missions of Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers, and later Reading Rainbow fit right in. Because PBS was always about representation, about giving children and families access to education, news, culture, whether they lived in the suburbs in rural America or in a redlined city neighborhood. But here's the complexity. Even while Sesame Street was breaking barriers, inequity still shaped who could access it. Some local PBS affiliates in the South refused to air the show at first because the cast was integrated. Think about that. A program created to support children was blocked in some areas because it dared show Black and white children learning side by side. And while public broadcasting opened doors, it was also chronically underfunded. The same families who relied on it most were the ones hurt the most when funding was threatened or cut. PBS has always been in a battle for its life since its inception. It was an excellent idea, but from the very beginning, it faced pushback from those who argued it wasn't necessary. Because PBS doesn't lean politically in any direction, its funding has been a constant target whenever budget talks come up on the Hill. Some claimed it was biased. Others claimed it was wasteful. Sesame Street itself came under fire more than once because it dared to talk about childhood traumas, about culture, and about family differences. In other words, because it dared to reflect real life. PBS's commitment to reporting news without bias and presenting culture without apology eventually created the perfect storm. And in 2025, after decades of attacks, PBS was finally defunded. Sesame Street mattered because it wasn't just a show. It was an act of advocacy, a recognition that children in overlooked neighborhoods deserved access to joy, education, and dignity. And even today, its impact continues to remind us when the system doesn't provide, communities create. PBS, Sesame Street, and Reading Rainbow are core memories of my childhood. But they weren't the only things I remember. I also remember the stories about the Black Panthers, about their ability to make real changes in neighborhoods, not just in New York, but in California too. Actually, that should be the other way around, not just in California, but in New York too. Both places I grew up. Because again, representation matters. And the Black Panthers are the type of representation that showed what happens when people decide to stop waiting for others and start doing what they can do themselves. Much like PBS decided to create the space needed for children's education, the Panthers created space for community survival and dignity, which means it's important to understand how this grassroots group helped shape some of the very supports we still see in early education and in public schools today. When we talk about the Black Panthers, there's so much history we could cover, but in this series, we're going to focus on the programs that help families and children. Because after all, this entire series is about childcare and how America reacts to even the smallest challenge or changes. And history shows us, even when those changes clearly benefit children and families, if they don't represent what they consider worthy, the changes may not last for the ones who are most vulnerable. So in this section, we'll look closely at the Panthers' Breakfast for Children program, their community health clinics, and their ties to early care and education, including Head Start. These programs weren't just radical ideas. They were lifelines. And they remind us that when the system doesn't provide, communities find a way. As a child, I would go to New York and visit my grandmother. And she couldn't cook. My grandma would burn rice. I remember getting up in the mornings, getting dressed, and walking to the local cafeteria for breakfast. I'd sit down next to the other children from the community eating breakfast and sometimes lunch, drinking milk. I hated milk. But I was told it was rude to throw away something that not everyone had access to. I listened to my grandmother as she explained that the Black Panthers were the reasons programs like this existed. And I remember feeling proud that something so powerful, so caring, came from our own community. Looking back, I suppose my career as an educator was cemented even earlier than I even thought. Because 1969, the same year my mother was a child, was the year the Panthers launched their Breakfast for Children program. The Breakfast for Children program started in Oakland, California, and quickly spread to cities across the country. By 1970, The Black Panthers were serving free breakfast to tens of thousands of children every day, often before schools themselves were prepared to do the same. They didn't just fill bellies, they filled a gap the system ignored. And the impact was undeniable. The success of the Panthers program pushed the federal government to expand its own free and reduced price school breakfast and lunch programs, policies that still exist today and that are currently being threatened. Free breakfast for children may seem like something everyone would welcome. But we have to remember, this program was born out of systematic failure. Enough families and children were struggling that a grassroots group, a group often vilified in the media, felt the need to step in and create a program to feed their own. The Panthers didn't wait for permission. They saw hungry children in their neighborhoods and chose action. Because hunger is a barrier to learning, and no child should sit in a classroom with an empty stomach. The Breakfast for Children program spread quickly from Oakland to New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and beyond. By the early 1970s, all of these children were eating because of the Black Panthers. While the Black Panthers were determined to help their community stay fed, they also knew health was just as important. Many families in these neighborhoods had no insurance and no access to affordable doctors. Once again, the system had failed. And once again, the Panthers stepped up. They created community health clinics known as the Free People's Clinics, where anyone in the neighborhood could walk in and get care. No insurance required, no cost, just dignity. The clinics weren't just about emergency care. They're about prevention, offering the oh-so-important preventative health care that families and children have been denied. Some of the services these clinics added included testing for sickle cell anemia and treatment for lead poisoning, both urgently needed at the time. It was becoming clear that lead in paint was causing serious health problems, and children in urban areas were most at risk. But cities weren't moving fast enough to fix the problem. So the Panthers did what the system wouldn't. They protected their communities. And what made these clinics so powerful was that they were run by people from the community for the community. In neighborhoods where families distrusted doctors or were denied care altogether, the Free People's Clinics offered dignity, safety, and access to what should have been a basic human right. By 1970, these clinics were serving families and children in cities across the country, showing what was possible when a grassroots movement decided healthcare couldn't wait. The Black Panthers didn't stop at making sure their communities were healthy. By the 1970s, there were dozens of clinics across the country run for the community by the community. But the clinics were only the beginning of their vision. The Panthers also believed in educating the community. They wanted children in places that respected them, reflected their culture, and were rooted in family and community. One of the first Panther-led education programs began in Oakland, California. In 1973, they opened the Oakland Community School. This school focused on giving children a strong foundation in Black history and critical thinking. Children weren't just learning math and reading. They were learning to see themselves with pride and to question the systems around them. The Oakland Community School ran for nearly a decade, serving as a model of what culturally rooted, community-driven education could look like, long before most mainstream programs even thought about representation. The Black Panthers' holistic beliefs in education helped shape many of the practices we still see today in Head Start, which was being developed at the federal level during the same era. It's a reminder that while the government often vilified the Panthers, their grassroots style of caring for their communities did not go unnoticed, and it was effective. Even today, in Head Start programs and in college classrooms training new early childhood educators, culture and community remain the foundation. The same foundation the Panthers built into their schools, like the Oakland Community School, which ran until 1982, the year before I was born. We've just covered decades of bias, injustice and fear, instability. That might be the best word to describe what it felt like to be a child living in the neighborhoods without access to medical care, dental care, or quality education. Areas cities refused to invest in because the residents were not considered worthy. But we've also traced a different thread, multiple threads: perseverance, determination, dignity, love, community. Because while the system was not set up for the Black and brown children who needed it most, there were always people out there fighting to create access, trying to close gaps, providing hope and building space where children could thrive. This section about redlining and systematic failure isn't just about what not to do. It's about what we could be doing. Because history has already shown us when communities create movements for themselves, they work. And that is why this podcast exists. Because I don't believe we have to wait to be saved. We can band together and save ourselves. During this episode, we touched lightly on what grassroots advocacy and movements can do when enough people care and come together. Episode 4 will dig deeper into advocacy itself, looking at its deeper impacts on childcare and on our society as a whole. Because in the next chapter, we're going to learn how to reclaim our roots.